There are disappearances that announce themselves with screams and chaos. Tacoma, Washington. Early morning, August 31st, 1961. A storm had passed through the city overnight. When the Burr family woke up, nothing looked violently wrong. But one bed was empty. For more than 60 years, this case has refused to close. In the early 1960s, Tacoma, Washington was a city that trusted its own quiet. It was a working port town shaped by water, trees, and routine, where most families believed they understood what danger looked like and where it did not belong. In the North End neighborhood, that belief was especially strong. The streets were calm, lined with modest family homes and trimmed lawns. Children played outside until dinner. Neighbors recognized each other by sight. Doors were locked at night, but more out of habit than fear. The Burr family lived on North 14th Street, not far from the University of Puget Sound. Their house blended in, seamlessly, with the others on the block. Nothing about it suggested vulnerability. Nothing marked it as a place where something unthinkable would happen. Inside the home lived Donald and Beverly Burr and their 5 children. Ann Marie Burr was 8 years old, the eldest daughter. She was small for her age, with blonde hair and a quiet, cautious demeanor. Family members later described her as obedient and gentle, a child who followed rules and preferred familiar spaces. She was afraid of the dark. She did not wander. She did not take risks. Wednesday, August 30th, 1961, passed without incident. Anne spent the day at home, playing and talking with her siblings. With school starting soon, there was a sense of transition in the air, anticipation mixed with the low-level anxiety common to children her age. When Anne asked about staying over at a friend's house that night, Beverly declined. "You'll want to be rested for school," she told her. Anne accepted the answer without protest. That evening, Tacoma was unusually warm and humid. Heat lingered after sunset, making sleep uncomfortable. Like many families in the neighborhood, the Burrs left windows partially open to let air circulate. It was normal. It was routine. The North End had no reputation for nighttime break-ins. Outside, the area around the house had changed subtly in recent months. The University of Puget Sound was expanding, and nearby construction sites had become a regular presence. During the day, workers moved through the neighborhood with trucks and tools. At night, the sites were empty, leaving behind open ground, trenches, and half-finished foundations. To residents, it was just construction. To anyone looking more closely, it altered the landscape in quiet ways. As night settled in, the Burr household prepared for bed. That night's sleeping arrangements were slightly different than usual. 2 of Anne's siblings decided to sleep in the basement, building a makeshift fort as a final summer adventure. Anne's youngest sister, Mary, had a broken arm and was wearing a cast. Because of that, Mary slept upstairs in Anne's room, so she could be cared for during the night. Before going to bed, Donald and Beverly checked the house. The front door was locked and secured with a chain. The back door was locked. Windows were left open only slightly. The family dog, a cocker spaniel named Barney, was placed on the staircase landing. Barney was known to bark when he heard unfamiliar sounds. "Everything's fine," Donald said, turning off the lights. Sometime after midnight, the weather shifted. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Wind followed, rattling branches and rooftops. Soon, the storm grew loud enough to dominate the neighborhood, masking smaller sounds beneath the steady rush of rain and gusts of wind. During the early morning hours, Anne woke up. Mary was crying, her injured arm causing her pain. Anne lifted her sister and carried her into their parents' bedroom. "Mom," she whispered. Beverly woke and took Mary into her arms, soothing her. "It's okay. she said softly. "Go back to bed now." Anne led Mary back to their room. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw Ann Marie Burr. The house grew quiet again. No one heard footsteps. No one heard a door open. Barney did not bark. Just after 5:30 a.m., Beverly Burr woke up. The storm had passed, leaving the ground wet and the air cool. As she walked through the house, she noticed something immediately. The front door was ajar. The chain lock hung loose. Beverly stopped. "Donald?" she called. He didn't answer. She stepped closer to the door, her hand lingering on the chain as if trying to remember whether it had been secured the night before. She knew it had. In the living room, a window stood open wider than it had been left. Her pace quickened as she went upstairs. She opened the bedroom door. Mary was in bed, still asleep. Anne's bed was empty. "Anne?" Beverly called, her voice light at first. She checked the hallway, the bathroom, the other bedrooms. "Anne, it's time to get up." There was no response. She searched the house again, opening closets, looking behind doors, moving faster now. "Anne!" she called again, louder this time. Donald joined her, confusion turning to alarm. Together they searched the basement, the yard, the street outside. Beverly ran to neighboring houses, knocking on doors. "Have you seen Anne?" she asked, her voice shaking. No one had. As minutes passed, panic took hold. "There's no way she'd leave," Beverly said. "She wouldn't go outside alone." The realization settled heavily over the house. Ann Marie Burr was missing. Shortly after 6 o'clock that morning, the Tacoma Police Department received a call. An 8-year-old girl had disappeared overnight from a locked home in the North End. There were no signs of struggle. No one had heard anything. The family dog had not reacted. As police were dispatched, the neighborhood was waking up. Cars started. Doors opened. The city moved forward into the morning. Behind one quiet house on North 14th Street, everything had stopped, and the search for Ann Marie Burr had just begun. The first patrol car arrived on North 14th Street just after sunrise. The storm clouds were breaking apart, leaving the street damp and quiet. From the outside, the Burr house looked unchanged. Curtains hung in place. The yard showed no obvious disturbance. It was the kind of morning where nothing appeared urgent until someone stepped inside. An officer approached the front door and paused. The chain lock dangled loose, resting against the doorframe. "You said this was secured last night?" he asked. "Yes," Beverly Burr replied immediately. "We always lock it. Always." Inside, officers moved carefully through the living room, noting what felt out of place and what did not. A window stood open wider than expected. Beneath it, a wooden bench from the yard had been dragged closer to the house. "That bench wasn't there before," Donald Burr said quietly. "It was farther out." An officer crouched beside it, studying the damp wood. On its surface, partially blurred by rain, was the faint outline of a shoe print. "It's hard to tell the size," one officer said. "Rain's washed most of it out." "But someone stood here," another replied. "That much is clear." Upstairs, the children's bedroom offered little clarity. Anne's bed was neatly made, undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no torn fabric, nothing that suggested violence. "She didn't scream," Beverly said, her voice breaking. "She would have screamed." In cases like this, investigators often look first for disorder. Broken locks, shattered glass, something obvious that explains what happened. The Burr house offered none of that. Everything suggested control, silence, time. The family dog, Barney, was brought up early in the questioning. "He barks at strangers," Beverly insisted. "Every time." One of the officers glanced at the staircase. "Did you hear him at all last night?" "No," Donald said. "Not once." The absence of barking immediately complicated the picture. Dogs were considered reliable early warning systems. When they didn't react, investigators had to consider uncomfortable possibilities. Either he didn't hear anyone, an officer said later, or he wasn't alarmed by whoever was there. As word spread, more officers arrived. The Tacoma Police Department quickly classified the situation as a possible abduction. Search teams were organized. The surrounding area was cordoned off. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalks, watching quietly as uniformed officers moved in and out of the house. One neighbor shook her head. "This just doesn't happen here," she said to a reporter. "We all know each other." Detectives began reconstructing the night, minute by minute. The window, the bench, the unlocked front door, the storm. Each detail was examined for meaning. "The rain worked against us," one detective later explained. "It erased tracks. It diluted scent. If there was anything outside, it didn't last long." Police dogs were brought in, but their handlers quickly ran into problems. The ground was soaked. Any trail that might have existed had been washed away hours earlier. Inside the house, officers searched for foreign fibers, fingerprints, anything that didn't belong. A thin red thread was discovered near the window frame. "That's not from anything in the house," an officer noted. At the time, fiber analysis was limited. The thread was bagged and logged, but there was no way to determine where it came from or who it belonged to. As the morning progressed, investigators faced a critical decision: how to define the crime. "If she walked out on her own," one officer said, "we'd expect her to be found nearby. She's afraid of the dark. She wouldn't go far." Another shook his head. "And she wouldn't leave her sister, not like this." By late morning, the working assumption solidified. Ann Marie Burr had not run away. Someone had taken her. The question was how. One theory suggested that Ann might have been awakened and lured downstairs. Perhaps someone had spoken to her through the open window. Perhaps she recognized the voice. But the locked front door complicated that idea. The chain lock had been disengaged from the inside. "That takes time," an investigator said, "and coordination." Another possibility was that Ann had been carried out. That would explain the lack of noise, the undisturbed bed, and the fact that Mary, sleeping in the same room, had not woken. "But why her?" a detective asked aloud. "Why that child, in that house, on that night?" As investigators canvassed the neighborhood, they interviewed anyone who had been awake during the storm. No one reported seeing a suspicious vehicle. No one recalled hearing footsteps or voices. The rain, which had covered the city in sound, had also erased memory. By midday, the Haifo search expanded. Officers and volunteers began combing nearby wooded areas, empty lots, and the construction sites near the University of Puget Sound. At one location, a trench partially filled with rainwater drew attention. "We need to check everything," a supervisor said. "Every hole, every ditch." But the scale of the area was daunting. Construction zones stretched across multiple blocks. Some trenches had already begun to be filled in as work resumed. Meanwhile, reporters arrived. Cameras pointed toward the Burr home. Microphones appeared. A police spokesperson addressed the press. "We are treating this as a missing child case with suspicious circumstances," he said. "We are asking anyone who may have seen or heard anything unusual overnight to come forward." Inside the house, Beverly Burr sat at the kitchen table, gripping a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "She wouldn't just disappear," she said quietly to an officer. "She was right here." As the first day wore on, investigators began to feel the weight of what the house was not telling them. There was no clear entry point, no clear exit route, no witness, no sound. Every theory relied on assumptions, about silence, about trust, about timing. And those assumptions mattered, because once an investigation commits to a narrative, once it decides how something happened, it shapes every question that follows. By the end of the day, Tacoma had mobilized. Search teams were growing. Tips were already coming in. The Burr house had been photographed, measured, and searched repeatedly. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Not where Ann Marie Burr had gone, but how someone could enter a home, take a child, and leave behind almost nothing, except questions that would only grow louder with time. By the afternoon of August 31st, 1961, the disappearance of Ann Marie Burr had grown beyond the walls of a single house. What began as a quiet, stunned morning inside the Burr home was now unfolding in full view of the city of Tacoma, pulling police officers, volunteers, reporters, and neighbors into a search that would quickly overwhelm its own boundaries. Patrol cars lined the streets near North 14th. Officers moved in pairs, knocking on doors, repeating the same questions until they lost their edges. Did you hear anything during the night? Did you see anyone outside? Did any vehicle seem out of place? The answers were almost always hesitant, often apologetic. No, just the storm. I thought I heard something, but it could have been the wind. I didn't look out the window. The rain had not only erased physical evidence, it had blurred memory. Sounds that might have mattered were swallowed by hours of wind and water. By the time the neighborhood woke, the night had already rearranged itself in people's minds. As the day went on, the search widened. Detectives requested additional manpower, and by early afternoon, volunteers began arriving. Some were neighbors. Others were strangers who had heard Ann's name on the radio or seen her photograph on the evening news. They showed up wearing work boots, carrying flashlights, bringing coffee, asking where they could help. A supervising officer gathered them near the edge of the neighborhood. "Check everything," he said. "Don't assume it's already been searched. If it looks like a place a child could hide or be hidden, we need eyes on it." Attention quickly shifted towards the University of Puget Sound. Construction zones dotted the area, their outlines still raw and unfinished. Trenches cut through the earth. Foundations lay exposed. Piles of dirt stood where buildings would soon rise. "These weren't here before," one volunteer muttered, staring into a muddy excavation. "Someone could have used this." Police agreed. Fresh construction complicated everything. The land itself had changed overnight. Areas that had not existed months earlier now demanded scrutiny. Some trenches were already filling with rainwater, turning searches into slow, methodical efforts that yielded nothing but soaked boots and frustration. At one site, a construction worker approached an officer quietly. "They poured concrete over there this morning," he said, pointing. "Early, before the news spread." The officer hesitated, then marked the location. "We'll note it," he said. But both men understood what that meant. Once concrete was poured, anything beneath it was effectively sealed away. As the sun dipped lower, search teams moved farther from the Burr home. Flashlights cut across brush and tree lines. Names were called into the dark, repeated until voices grew hoarse. "Ann! Ann Marie!" The words echoed briefly, then disappeared into the trees. Back at North 14th Street, detectives continued to work inside the house, revisiting details that now felt heavier with every passing hour. They re-examined the window, the bench beneath it, the front door, still unsettling in its quiet simplicity. "That chain had to be undone from the inside," one detective said, staring at it. "Which means she didn't just walk out." Another officer nodded. "And there's no sign she was dragged." Which left one conclusion increasingly difficult to avoid. Someone had control of the situation. As the first day turned into evening, pressure mounted. Tips were flooding in, each one demanding attention. A man seen walking late at night. A car parked briefly on the block. A shadow near a fence. Most tips were vague. Many contradicted each other. "We're chasing ghosts," one officer muttered, flipping through notes. Local newspapers ran Ann's photo on the front page. Television crews arrived, setting up cameras near the Burr home. Microphones were placed in front of neighbors who struggled to find words. "This is a good neighborhood," one woman said, shaking her head. "We look out for each other." Police spokespersons tried to project calm. "There is no indication of an ongoing threat," one said at a press briefing. But behind the scenes, investigators were uneasy. The absence of evidence was not reassuring. It was paralyzing. "There's nothing here that tells us who," a detective admitted to a colleague. "Only that someone knew exactly what they were doing." Inside the Burr home, time seemed suspended. Friends and relatives filled the living room, speaking in hushed tones. Beverly Burr remained close to the phone, jumping at every ring. "She's scared of the dark," Beverly said again and again. "She wouldn't just go outside." Late that night, as exhaustion set in across the search teams, the investigation reached its first turning point. A name began to surface during neighborhood interviews. A teenage boy who lived nearby, someone who had been seen talking with Ann in the weeks before she disappeared. Neighbors described him as attentive, sometimes overly so. "He liked her," one person said. "Everyone knew that." Another added, "He was always around." The name appeared more than once. Then again. Then again. Detectives took notice. "Bring him in," one officer said quietly. "Let's start there." It was a familiar instinct. In the absence of physical evidence, investigations often gravitate toward what feels explainable. Someone known. Someone nearby. Someone whose presence can be traced. By the morning of September 1st, Tacoma was fully aware that Ann Marie Burr was missing. Search efforts continued. Volunteers returned. Tips kept coming. But beneath the surface, the investigation had begun to narrow, not because answers were emerging, but because uncertainty demanded direction. And as detectives prepared to question their first serious suspect, the case entered a new phase. One where assumptions would harden. One where early conclusions might shape everything that followed. When Robert Bruza was no longer the focus of the investigation, the search for Ann Marie Burr did not slow. It fractured. With no physical evidence tying any one person to the Burr home, detectives were forced to widen their scope. That shift brought new names into the case, men who, on paper, looked far more dangerous than a teenage boy from the neighborhood. One of those names was Hugh Beon Morse. Morse was not a rumor or a neighbor's suspicion. He was a convicted killer. In 1959, just 2 years before Ann disappeared, a 9-year-old girl named Candy Rogers had been abducted and murdered in the Tacoma area. For a time, Morse had been considered a suspect in that crime. "He's the kind of person we have to look at," one investigator said. "We can't ignore him." Police questioned Morse in October 1961. Unlike Bruzas, Morse did not appear nervous. He answered questions calmly, almost indifferently. "Were you in the North End the night Ann Burr disappeared?" an officer asked. "No," Morse replied. "I wasn't anywhere near there." Detectives pressed him, moving through timelines, asking about his movements, his vehicle, his habits. Morse denied involvement repeatedly. There was no evidence placing him near the Burr home. No witness, no vehicle description, nothing concrete. As the interrogation ended, one officer shook his head. "He's bad," he said quietly. "But bad doesn't mean guilty here." Morse was released. For the Burr family, each new suspect represented a fragile resurgence of hope. "Maybe this is it," Beverly Burr said, after learning police were questioning Morse. "Maybe this one leads somewhere." It didn't. As weeks passed, other names surfaced, men with prior records, men who lived alone, men who worked odd hours. Each was questioned. Each was examined against the same unanswered questions. Where were you during the storm? Did you know the Burr family? Had you ever been near the house on North 14th Street? Most interviews ended the same way, with uncertainty. At the same time, investigators were still following tips from the public. Sightings were reported from different parts of the city. Girl seen walking with an older man. A child matching Ann's description in a car. A figure spotted near a bus stop. "We're getting calls from everywhere," one officer told a reporter. "Most of them don't pan out." Some tips were well-meaning but unreliable. Others were fueled by fear. In a city gripped by anxiety, every unfamiliar face felt suspicious. One caller insisted she had seen Ann near the waterfront. Another claimed to have heard a child crying near a wooded area days after the disappearance. Search teams followed each lead, often finding nothing. "We don't want to miss anything," a detective said, "but we're chasing shadows." By late fall, the pace of the investigation began to change. The massive search operation scaled back. Volunteers returned to their lives. Officers were reassigned to other cases. The Burr home grew quieter. Inside the police department, Ann Marie Burr's file grew thicker. Pages were added. Leads were crossed out. Names were underlined, then circled, then dismissed. "There's no thread that connects any of this," one investigator admitted. "It's just fragments." As winter approached, the case faced a familiar danger. Not from malice, but from time. Without new evidence, the investigation shifted from active search to sustained inquiry. Detectives revisited notes, re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined assumptions made in the first days. One assumption lingered stubbornly: that Ann had been taken by someone local, someone who knew the neighborhood, someone who understood the routines of the Burr household, someone comfortable enough to move silently through a family home during a storm. That belief guided interviews and narrowed focus, even as the case struggled to produce results. Meanwhile, the Burr family lived in suspension. Every phone call carried hope. Every knock at the door brought dread. "I keep thinking she'll just walk back in," Beverly told a friend. "Like this was all some mistake." Donald Burr threw himself into cooperation with police, answering questions repeatedly, retracing steps, revisiting the construction sites near the university. At one point, while searching near the University of Puget Sound, Donald noticed a teenage boy standing in a ditch at a construction site. The boy appeared to be kicking dirt into the trench. "He looked at me and smiled," Donald later recalled. "It wasn't a friendly smile." Donald reported the sighting to police. Officers noted it, but by the time they followed up, the trench had been filled with concrete. "There was nothing left to check," an officer said. At the time, the sighting did not seem extraordinary. Teenagers wandered construction sites. Boys kicked dirt. It was logged and filed away. As the months passed, the case lost momentum in the public eye. Ann's photograph still appeared in newspapers, but with less frequency. New crimes replaced old headlines. Inside the department, investigators continued working the case, but without urgency. There were no arrests to pursue, no evidence to test, no clear suspect to confront. "It's not that we stopped caring," one officer said later. "It's that there was nothing left to push against." By the end of 1961, Ann Marie Burr had been missing for 4 months. The city of Tacoma had searched its fields, its forests, its neighborhoods, and its conscience. What remained was silence. and silence in missing child cases has a way of hardening into permanence. Unbeknownst to investigators at the time, the case was not finished evolving. It was only waiting for another crime, waiting for another name, waiting for history to circle back on itself. By the summer of 1962, nearly a year had passed since Ann Marie Burr vanished from her home in Tacoma. The city had moved on in visible ways. Streets were busy again. Construction at the University of Puget Sound continued uninterrupted. New routines replaced old ones. But for the Burr family, time had not softened anything. It had only stretched the uncertainty thinner day by day. Inside the Tacoma Police Department, Ann's case was still open, but it had settled into a quieter rhythm. Leads were followed when they came in. Files were reviewed periodically, but there were no active search teams, no daily briefings, no sense of momentum. Then, in June 1962, a report arrived that changed the emotional gravity of the case. It came from far away. Portage-la-Prairie, Manitoba, a small Canadian town nearly 1,300 miles from Tacoma. A gas station attendant had contacted local authorities with an unsettling story. Days earlier, he said, a young girl had entered the station with an adult couple. The girl appeared frightened. She avoided eye contact. When the attendant spoke to her, she whispered something that made him pause. She said she was from Tacoma, he reported. According to the attendant, the girl matched Ann Marie Burr's description closely. Similar age, similar hair, color. Similar build. She looked tired, nervous, as if she did not want to be there. When the attendant asked more questions, the man accompanying the girl interrupted sharply. "We're in a hurry," he said. The woman took the girl's arm. The trio left quickly. The attendant watched their vehicle pull away, unease settling in after them. He wrote down what he could remember and reported the incident later that day. By the time the report reached Tacoma, it had already grown in significance. "She said Tacoma," one officer repeated, reading the file. "That's not a common detail." Detectives contacted Canadian authorities immediately. Descriptions were exchanged. Sketches were compared to Ann's photographs. The resemblance was close enough to justify serious attention. For the first time since Ann disappeared, the case shifted away from the assumption that she was dead. "What if she's alive?" one investigator asked quietly. The possibility changed everything. If Ann had been seen nearly a year later and hundreds of miles away, it suggested a very different crime. Not a local abduction that ended quickly, but something prolonged, something mobile, something harder to trace. Police considered new theories. Perhaps Ann had been taken by someone passing through Tacoma, a long-haul driver, a transient worker, someone with no fixed ties to the neighborhood. Or perhaps she had been taken for a purpose investigators had not previously emphasized. Trafficking, illegal adoption, custodial concealment. Each theory reopened doors that had already begun to close. The Burr family was notified cautiously. Detectives did not promise anything. They explained the uncertainty. "It might not be her," an officer said carefully, "but we have to check." For Beverly Burr, the report ignited a fragile hope. "She could still be alive," she said, clinging to the words as if saying them aloud might make them true. "She could be out there somewhere." The family provided updated photographs, dental records, anything that might help confirm the sighting. Canadian authorities attempted to track the vehicle described by the attendant, but the details were incomplete. No license plate, only a vague description of the adults. The trail went cold quickly. Still, the sighting could not be dismissed. It entered the case file as one of the most compelling unresolved leads. For investigators, it complicated their work in a different way. If Ann had survived for months after her disappearance, then early assumptions about timing, motive, and offender profile might have been wrong. It forces us to rethink everything, one detective admitted. But rethinking does not always lead to clarity. In the months that followed, other sightings were reported. Some came from within Washington state, others from as far away as the Midwest. Each described a girl who looked like Ann. Each offered hope. Each dissolved under scrutiny. "Every blonde child became Ann," one officer said. "We wanted to believe." As sightings multiplied, so did uncertainty. Investigators struggled to balance skepticism with obligation. Every tip had to be checked. Every lead had to be logged. But the more the case stretched outward geographically, the less control investigators felt they had over it. "We're chasing possibilities now," a detective said. "Not evidence." The Portage la Prairie sighting remained the most credible. It was detailed, specific. Anchored by a clear statement, Tacoma, that could not easily be explained away. Yet even that lead ended in silence. By late 1962, the investigation faced a new emotional contradiction. Ann might be alive, or she might not. Both possibilities coexisted, each equally unprovable. Hope, once reignited, became its own burden. For the Burr family, it was impossible to let go. "If there's even a chance," Beverly said, "we have to hold on to it." Police continued to keep the case open. But with no way to confirm sightings, no suspect to pursue, and no physical evidence to test, progress stalled again. The file grew thicker. The answers did not. Years would pass before the case of Ann Marie Burr was reframed once more, this time not by a sighting, but by a name that would come to define an era of American crime. A name no one in Tacoma had taken seriously in 1961. A name that, in hindsight, had always been uncomfortably close. In the mid-1970s, the name Ted Bundy began appearing in headlines across the United States. At first, it was just another arrest, then another charge, then another body. By the time Bundy's crimes became fully known, he was no longer just a suspect. He was a pattern, a method, a catalog of violence that forced investigators across multiple states to revisit old assumptions. In Washington state, detectives began pulling cold files from shelves, cases that had never been solved, cases that suddenly felt uncomfortably familiar. One of those files bore the name Ann Marie Burr. 1961. Ted Bundy was 14 years old and living in Tacoma's North End. His family home was only a few blocks from the Burr residence. He attended school nearby. He walked the same streets. He delivered newspapers along a route that passed directly by the Burr house. At the time of Ann's disappearance, Bundy had not been on any law enforcement radar. He was a teenager, quiet, intelligent, largely invisible. But in hindsight, proximity began to matter. "So he lived right there?" one investigator asked years later, tracing the map with a finger. "Right there," another replied. As Bundy's criminal profile emerged, details from Ann Marie Burr's case took on new significance: the victim type, the timing, the control, the silence. Bundy's later victims were often described as petite, light-haired, and compliant. Many were taken in situations where trust or familiarity played a role. He moved quietly. He planned carefully. He exploited opportunity. Investigators began asking uncomfortable questions. Could Bundy have started earlier than previously believed? During interviews with detectives and journalists while incarcerated, Bundy made statements that only deepened suspicion. "I started younger than people think," he said once. Much younger. In another conversation, he spoke cryptically about early fantasies, early experiments. "There were mistakes," he said, "things that didn't go the way I wanted." For those revisiting the Burr case, the words lingered. In 1961, the Burr home had been entered quietly. No forced entry, no struggle. The dog did not bark. Ann did not scream. "That's control," one profiler said later. "Not panic." Another detail resurfaced. On the morning Ann was discovered missing, Donald Burr had been searching near the University of Puget Sound when he noticed a teenage boy standing in a construction trench. The boy appeared to be kicking dirt into the hole. When Donald looked at him, the boy smiled. "It wasn't right," Donald later said. "It stayed with me." At the time, the sighting meant little. Construction sites were common. Teenagers wandered. Nothing connected the boy to the crime. But years later, after seeing Bundy's face on television, Donald Burr felt a jolt of recognition. "That was him," he said quietly. "I'm sure of it." Investigators revisited the construction records. The trench Donald described had been filled with concrete shortly after Ann's disappearance. No search had been conducted before it was sealed. "If she was there," one detective said, "we'd never know." Another connection emerged through Bundy's family circle. One of Bundy's relatives had taught piano lessons to Ann Marie Burr. Bundy had visited the home on occasion. He could have known her name, an investigator noted. He could have known her routine. That familiarity mattered. The dog's silence mattered. The chain lock undone from the inside mattered. Each detail alone was inconclusive. Together, they formed a troubling constellation. In the 1980s, as Bundy sat on death row in Florida, investigators attempted to confront him with the Burr case directly. He denied involvement. "I didn't do that," Bundy wrote in a letter to Ann's mother, Beverly Burr. "I was not out at night. I did not take your daughter." The letter was calm, polite, precise. To some, it sounded convincing. To others, it sounded exactly like Ted Bundy. "He lied constantly," one investigator said, especially when denial gave him power. Bundy's admissions in other cases were selective. He confessed when it benefited him. He withheld details when it did not. He played with ambiguity. He enjoyed control, a psychologist explained, even at the end. For law enforcement, the lack of physical evidence remained the central obstacle. No body had ever been found. No personal item definitively linked Ann to Bundy. In 2011, decades after Ann disappeared and long after Bundy's execution, Tacoma police submitted preserved evidence for modern DNA testing. Technology had advanced. Hope resurfaced briefly, but the samples were degraded. Time had done what rain and silence had started. The results were inconclusive. Bundy could not be confirmed. He could not be excluded. The case remained open. To this day, Ann Marie Burr is officially listed as missing, endangered. Her disappearance has never been resolved. Ted Bundy remains a suspect, but not a convicted one in her case. For investigators, the Burr file stands as a reminder of how easily early assumptions can shape decades of uncertainty. For the Burr family, it is a wound without edges. And for those who study the case now, one question continues to hover, unanswered. If Ted Bundy did not take Ann Marie Burr, then who did? And if he did, how early does a monster begin? By the early 2010s, more than half a century had passed since Ann Marie Burr vanished from her bedroom in Tacoma. The city had changed beyond recognition. Streets were widened. Buildings replaced empty lots. Construction sites that once drew attention had long since been absorbed into permanent structures. But the case file remained. Inside the Tacoma Police Department, Ann Marie Burr was still listed as missing, endangered. The designation mattered. It meant the case was not closed. It meant there was no official conclusion, no legal ending, no resolution that could be signed and archived. "We don't close cases like this," one investigator said. Not without answers. Advances in forensic science offered a final possibility. In 2011, detectives revisited the physical evidence preserved from the Burr home. Items that had once been logged with limited expectations were now viewed through the lens of modern technology. "If there's anything left," a technician said, "DNA will find it." The evidence was sent to a state crime lab. Analysts worked carefully, attempting to extract genetic material from fibers and biological traces that had survived decades of storage. But time had already done its damage. The samples were degraded, fragmented, incomplete. "We can't get a usable profile," the lab reported. "Not nuclear DNA, not enough to make a comparison." The results were classified as inconclusive. Ted Bundy could not be linked to the evidence. He could not be ruled out. For investigators, the outcome was both expected and devastating. "Technology can't fix what wasn't preserved," one detective said quietly. With no new forensic avenue available, the case returned to its familiar state, suspended between theories and silence. The Burr family continued to live with that silence. Beverly Burr, in rare interviews, spoke carefully, choosing words that avoided finality. "I still believe someone knows," she said. "I believe the truth is out there." Donald Burr passed away without knowing what happened to his daughter. For those close to the family, that absence of closure became part of the tragedy itself. "He never stopped thinking about it," a family friend said. "Never." In the broader world of criminal investigation, the Burr case became a reference point, a lesson in the fragility of early evidence and the danger of premature assumptions. "If the scene had been preserved differently," one cold case analyst noted, "we might be having a different conversation." Others focused on the psychology of the crime. "The control involved is significant," a profiler explained. "This wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate." That assessment kept Bundy's name tethered to the case, even decades after his execution. His proximity, his age, his later admissions about early behavior. But suspicion is not proof. And proof, in this case, remains absent. The construction trench near the University of Puget Sound still exists only in memory. The concrete poured over it became permanent long before anyone understood what might have been lost. "If she's there," an investigator once said, "she'll never be found." The Portage la Prairie sighting remains unresolved. The gas station attendant never wavered in his account. Canadian authorities found no way to confirm or deny it conclusively. "It could have been her," one detective admitted, "or it could have been someone else entirely." That ambiguity defines the case. Ann Marie Burr exists now in fragments, photographs, reports, memories, and unanswered questions. She is frozen at 8 years old, wearing a blue nightgown, stepping out of childhood into an absence that has never been explained. For law enforcement, the file remains open. For the city of Tacoma, the case lingers as a quiet scar, mostly invisible but never healed. And for those who study it, the case resists resolution not because it lacks theories, but because every theory depends on something that can no longer be tested. A sound that was never heard, a footprint erased by rain, a moment lost before anyone knew it mattered. What remains is not certainty, but weight. The weight of knowing that a child disappeared from a locked home during a storm in a quiet neighborhood, and that the system designed to protect her could not follow her beyond the doorway. The story of Ann Marie Burr does not end with an arrest or a confession. It ends with a file that is still open, and a question that has waited more than 60 years for someone willing or able to answer it. I first encountered the name Ann Marie Burr the way many people do, with a question, not an answer. It wasn't a case with a body. It wasn't a case with a confession. It wasn't even a case with a clear ending. It was simply a name, a date, and a quiet sentence that refused to resolve itself. 8-year-old girl disappears from her bedroom. The more I read, the more unsettling it became, not because of what was known, but because of what was missing. A locked house, a storm loud enough to erase sound, a child who was afraid of the dark, a dog that did not bark. Those details are often repeated, in summaries of the case, but repetition doesn't make them less disturbing. If anything, it sharpens them, because each one narrows the possibilities while never fully closing them. Over the years, investigators have leaned toward one name more than any other: Ted Bundy. The logic is understandable. Proximity, later behavior, his own cryptic statements about starting young, the way his known crimes echo elements of Ann's disappearance. But logic is not the same as certainty. Bundy fits the outline, but outlines can be deceptive. They tempt us to draw lines that feel complete even when they aren't. And in this case, there is no physical proof tying him to Ann Marie Burr. No recovered object, no confirmed witness, no DNA that survived long enough to speak clearly. What troubles me most is not the absence of an answer, but how easily absence becomes permission for assumptions, for narrative closure, for moving on. Early in the investigation, the focus narrowed quickly. A teenage boy. Known face. A familiar explanation. That narrowing may have been human, even inevitable. But it also consumed time, the only resource that never renews itself in cases like this. I keep returning to the construction site near the University of Puget Sound. Not because it proves anything, but because it represents something larger: how quickly physical space can erase opportunity for truth. Concrete poured, trenches filled, possibilities sealed away not out of malice, but routine. If Ann Marie Burr is there, she will never be found. And if she isn't, that absence still matters. Because it tells us how much depends on timing, on instinct, on someone recognizing a moment as critical before it passes. The sighting in Canada is another fragment I can't fully dismiss. It is easy to label it false hope, a familiar pattern in missing child cases. And it may have been exactly that. But the specificity, the word Tacoma, lingers. It resists easy dismissal. Hope, in this case, may have prolonged pain. But the absence of hope would have done something worse. It would have closed the door too early. I don't know what happened to Ann Marie Burr. I don't know if her disappearance was the first act of someone who would later become infamous, or the work of someone whose name will never appear in history books. I don't know if the truth lies buried under concrete, scattered across borders, or locked inside a memory that has never been spoken aloud. What I do know is this: the story we tell ourselves about safety, the belief that quiet neighborhoods are immune, that locked doors are enough, that danger announces itself, is fragile. Ann Marie Burr didn't disappear from a dark alley or an unfamiliar place. She vanished from her own bedroom, during a storm, in a city that believed it understood itself. That's what makes this case endure, not because it is sensational, not because it has a villain we can point to with certainty, but because it reminds us how thin the line is between ordinary life and irreversible loss. Ann Marie Burr would be in her 70s today. A lifetime exists between the girl in the blue nightgown and the woman she never became. That space, those unlived years, is the real measure of this case. And until the day someone can say, without hesitation, this is what happened, the story remains unfinished. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as a question we are still responsible for asking. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told carefully, without shortcuts or easy answers, consider subscribing to the channel. Sharing this video helps keep unresolved cases visible, and sometimes visibility is the only thing that time hasn't taken away. Thank you for watching.